In my mind, one of the key things is for the proponent to try and work out what it wants to do with that business and whether there are certain conditions that it needs to impose which will, before the DOCA would effectuate, things like regulatory approvals, whether that's getting, how they're going to ensure that the mining tenements are in place on the other side of the deed of company arrangement, whether or not there's, regulatory approvals in terms of, FIRB, for example, other things like whether or not it's a managed investment scheme, do you need approval from ASIC? There's all sorts of things like that need to be considered in the structuring of your DOCA to ensure that you, if you're the proponent, can give it the best prospects of success.
Cathro and Partners presents The Cut, a podcast about all things insolvency.
All right, well, hello everyone. My name's Simon Cathro. I am here hosting the next episode of The Cut. This year we're focusing on insolvency lawyers and talking about specific insolvency and restructuring topics. My pleasure today to have Sam Dundas from King Wood Mallesons. How are you, Sam?
Oh, I'm great. Thanks, Simon. Really appreciate you having me along here today. Very excited to be part of it.
Before we get into our topic, which we're talking about deed of company arrangements today, but I thought it might be useful for you to just talk a bit about yourself and the firm you currently work in, just to give everyone a bit of an overview of who you are and the firm that you work for.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, Sam Dundas, partner at King Wood Mallesons, based here in Perth, but have a bit of a national kind of practice in terms of the types of matters I'm involved in. I've been a lawyer now for almost 20 years, which is showing my age.
Wow.
Specialised obviously in restructuring and insolvency type work. Look, I kind of fell into that, not long after I started as a lawyer, really. Always, combination of, in terms of people that were doing it at the time and then also my interest in the work. It's a really dynamic area, great mixture of advisory, transactional, litigation work, always been attracted to it. In terms of
right.
So look, always loved it and found it an interesting area, continue to find it an interesting area.
And it's a fairly busy period for us at the moment. It's fair to say, isn't it, in terms of the work?
Yeah, no, it has been. So it's like always, you get some of that informal advisory stuff, sort of pre-formal appointments. There's obviously ongoing kind of litigation that you might have, and then there's the transactional stuff. So, yeah, it has been a busy period, and I think people are generally, optimistic about it becoming an even busier period as we go into the next year or so.
Most of the economy would say pessimistic, but we have a very strange sense of humour. But in all seriousness, we are going through one of those periods in the cycle where insolvencies unfortunately are high and up. And, we're hearing a lot of media around record appointments. But it's a little bit different to the GFC, and I don't know if you have a different view, Sam, but I sort of think we're sort of seeing a different style of correction here, in the sense that in the GFC, we saw the big end of town and financial structuring come under the microscope and have to restructure. And then it sort of made its way into the small to medium businesses at the back end of that cycle. But this time it's sort of the other way around. We're seeing the small to medium businesses really get cleaned out, primarily as a result of the COVID and the tax debts that are the impacts that those two issues had. Is that sort of, do you have a different view in that sense?
No, that's very consistent with what I see as well, Simon. Being based in WA, a lot of the work that I see is kind of West Perth, mid-cap miners. It is that kind of middle space. A lot of the stuff has been in that area. That is the area that we've been, seeing some stress in, particularly with some of the kind of more volatile fluctuations in, the sort of battery minerals and all those types of things has led to some of those entities coming under stress. And like you said, it's been that kind of more mid-cap level and space which has sort of seen that stress and has seen the kind of informal and formal kind of work.
Yeah, great. Well, we're talking today about deeds of company arrangement, which I know is a An interesting topic for those that are not across the insolvency processes. A deed of company arrangement is something that often comes out of a voluntary administration process where companies go into voluntary administration, and they've fundamentally got three choices, but two that usually happen, and that is they enter into what's called a deed of company arrangement. Or they go into liquidation. A deed of company arrangement is fundamentally an offer to creditors that is usually can be structured in any way it can, and is better than a liquidation. So I thought, Sam, we might just touch on deeds, what proponents, the structure. You want to sort of give just run through some thoughts on that and let us know, what a deed of company arrangement is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Simon. I mean, they're an incredibly flexible instrument, and I think a lot of practitioner-led innovation since they were first introduced in the early 90s has resulted in an expansion of ways in which the deed of company arrangement can be used to achieve those objects you were talking about, being the objects of Part 5.3a, either maximising the chances of the company or business continuing existence, and if that's not possible, then maximising the return to creditors and members in a way that's a better result than they would get in an immediate winding up. Now, in terms of sort of some practical and legal tips that I've sort of come across, I think it might be useful to talk about how DOCA proponents can put together a DOCA proposal to give it the best prospects of success. And in my mind, there's a number of, key things that you can do early on, particularly when the VA is there, because as we know, it's a short process, 20 business days or 25 business days if you're at Christmas or Easter. I think getting in early engagement with the administrator, understanding the creditor profile, what is the quantity of those the creditors in terms of their value and the number of them, and understanding the value of the business, so that you can make, a proper assessment of what fund would need to be put together to ensure that you've got a better return to those creditors than they get in a winding up. Will give you a sense of whether or not, early on as a proponent, you're actually going to be interested in acquiring that business and can actually achieve a result out of it. And then there's other things, around how it might be operated on the other side if it's effectuated. In my mind, one of the key things is for the proponent to try and work out what it wants to do with that business, and whether, there are certain conditions that it needs to impose, which will, before a DOCA would effectuate, and things like, regulatory approvals, whether that's getting, how they're going to ensure that the mining tenements are in place on the other side of the deed of company arrangement, whether or not there's, regulatory approvals in terms of, FIRB, for example, other things like whether or not it's a managed investment scheme. Do you need approval from ASIC? There's all sorts of things like that need to be considered in the structuring of your DOCA to ensure that you, if you're the proponent, can give it the best prospects of success. And then what it is that you're prepared to invest in that DOCA in terms of creating a DOCA fund to ensure that better return to creditors. And it may be that you want to divvy up that DOCA fund in different ways in accordance for different classes of creditors, in order to if you thought that certain creditor classes were more important to the value of the business going forward.
Yeah. And there's a lot. I mean, you're probably only just touching the sides of all the considerations that happen on a company that's looking to enter into a deed of company arrangement, because every company is subject to its industry requirements, its regulation requirements, its licensing requirements, certain legislation. And whilst we rely on the Corporations Act, and that's where Part 5.3 is from, that's the structure to enable the administration of the deed of company arrangement to be achieved. But then the functioning and the ongoing ability of a company to continue to trade is subject to its respective industry and legislative commitment requirements. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, I suppose, let's break down what you said there, because the deed proponent, okay, so that's the party that puts forward an offer, right?
Yeah.
An offer to usually compromise the creditor pool, and we have to deal with often secure creditors, employees, and unsecured creditors at its most basic level, right?
Yep.
And there's often sometimes we have things like subordinated claims and all different things, but on its most basic level, that's what we're confronted with. So, what are some of the things that you've seen in terms of the parties that are the deed proponents? List the obvious ones, and then have you seen any interesting people come forward as being the party that wants to put up an offer?
Yeah, I have, Simon. I think if you're thinking about kind of, I don't want to keep going back to WA mining assets, but that's typically what I tend to do in Western Australia. But if you think about that, there's often, it can be, so if you've got a mine that's in distress, it can often be, by way of example, another entity, so that is, maybe has an interest in a mine nearby of a similar type of asset. So someone who has a natural interest in that type of asset and might want to look to combine the two assets together to grow their business. It could also be often it is the case that some of the major creditors of the very company themselves are the ones that may want to, put forward a proposal, turn themselves from being the creditor of that business into the owner of that business on the other side of it. And whether that, in the case of a mining example, whether or not that is let's call it a mining services provider who thinks, I've been doing all the work on this mine site anyway. I'm in this deep. I could convert my interest into an equity position in that company that's in distress, and then through to, let's call it, foreign investors and funds who might be, interested in taking, a position in an asset like that. And if you think about things like, the battery minerals, etc., there's been a number of instances of Chinese investors being proponents and looking to take a stake in those types of minerals and things in Australia. Yeah.
That's obviously topical at the moment, as we've seen a little bit of a tactical move between the US and the Chinese around that part of the industry. But from my perspective, if I look at some of the more well-known matters, so on Napoleon, we had fundamentally a competitor come in, or a retailer that was wanting to get into the space of makeup, and put forward the DOCA. That came out of a sale process that we did. On Fedora, we had the parent company put up the DOCA, and then on a smaller job, which was a forklift operator, where the actual directors passed away, so there was no directors left at the time of appointment. And that's a whole podcast in itself, trying to get appointed as through the courts. It ended up being the son, who was also the managing director of the senior management member of the actual business, because his parents had obviously were too old and ill to operate the business. So it really just says to me, anyone can be that proponent. And
absolutely.
And we've obviously seen appointments where, the directors go into administration, they've got this huge plan of doing a restructure, and then someone comes along and says, hey, I've got a better deal. And as the administrator, we really need to consider those offers. And this is one of the things that directors should think about, is when you do go into administration, the business is up for anyone to put forward an outcome that's better for creditors.
Absolutely, and lots of there's always kind of scuttlebutt out there about directors trying to use the process of a deed of company arrangement to effectively wipe the liabilities of a company, and thoughts about phoenixing and things like that. But like you rightly point out, Simon, once the administrator is that independent person going in, their job is to entertain all offers and to look at whether it's a competitor who has an interest in similar types of assets already, a major creditor of the company, whether unsecured or even and secured. They're obviously clearly sometimes people who are particularly interested in the business, and they may be wanting to change their position from being a secured creditor into, an owner of that business ultimately on the other side. And so, like you said, ultimately it's about getting the best return to creditors. And there are proponents, as you rightly say, can come from all sorts of different positions, whether or not people who have existing interest in assets like that, or have essentially stakes already in the business as a creditor, unsecured, or a secured creditor, or the existing management team, or others like that.
Yeah, great. So you mentioned earlier about different classes. So for those that are not across this, we have under the Corporations Act Section 556, which sets out a set of order or priorities that when we convert our assets into cash and pay that out to various stakeholders in that process, we rely on that section. And the cost of the administration liquidation is first, the employees are second, unsecured's third at its most basic level. Again, there's a whole bunch of subsections in that section that make life a little bit interesting for us, and that's why we need to engage lawyers sometimes. But talk me through some of the examples that you're aware of or experienced where that sort of usual reliance on Section 556 gets sort of upended and changed.
Yeah, it's a good point, Simon. And so, right, as you've rightly said, that there is already in 556 a regime in terms of priorities for those different classes of creditors, one of which obviously being employees and need to get essentially a super priority. So what you invariably see then in a deed of company arrangement is their priority reflected in the waterfall of payments which are going out. Now, in my mind, there is then, and secured creditors, as we know, are not going to be bound by the deed of company arrangement unless they vote in favour of it. So they'll either be in the DOCA by choice or they won't be in the DOCA and they'll sit outside the regime. Now, as to other unsecured creditors, there are lots of ways that could potentially be changed in terms of and differentiated as between unsecured creditors in the waterfall. And there are a number of instances where an administrator may take the view that, in terms of there being particular business critical suppliers whose ongoing supply is very important to the future success of the business on the other side of the deed of company arrangement, that it warrants those particular creditors receiving a priority in term or a greater share of the proceeds in the DOCA fund than other unsecured creditors. And it's been well recognised, in terms of the authorities in relation to deeds of company arrangement, that the courts will permit there to be discrimination between unsecured creditor classes if there is a clear commercial benefit to the company on the other side that warrants, a business critical supplier being given, a greater share of those amounts. So you may not only see the standard 556, like you pointed out, where you've got priority to employees, which needs to be honoured to ensure that they get, a greater, return than liquidation, but then also a differentiation as between unsecured creditor classes as well.
Yeah. And the reality of those kinds of DOCAs is that we often see the tax office right at the bottom of the pile.
Yep.
And they don't like that.
No.
And so that sort of begs the question, you think of the words oppression and being unfairly treated, that there's some elements of risk when you start to play around with the priorities and put people put the same priority class of creditors into different classes. There's always that risk, I suppose, that the parties that are affected the most could run off the court and try and challenge that. Have you had any, or are you across any of that sort of a situation where that kind of situation arose?
Yeah, someone I have. I've been on both sides of it, acting for, in a situation where the DOCA's been challenged, but also in situations of challenging as well, acting for interested parties. And I like you rightly point out, if there is the greater degree of discrimination between classes of creditors, I think puts it on that spectrum of risk in terms of giving it a greater prospect of people being unhappy and saying challenging under Section 445D that they've been unfairly prejudiced or unfairly discriminated against in the deed of company arrangement. So I think the greater degree of differentiation that you end up having as between creditor classes, and if there is, I guess I'll call it, a lack of a legitimate, clear commercial benefit to the company that can be justified in terms of, like I gave the example before, a business critical supplier, having there's some rationale to that occurring and them getting a greater share. If you lack that, and so therefore, I guess I'll call it the greater degree of differentiation and discrimination, and lacking a commercial rationale, I think increases your risks and likelihood of being challenged under 445D.
One of the things the administrator has to do is they have to make a recommendation. So the administrator needs to put their head on the block on by providing their professional opinion as to, is liquidation better to than the deed of company arrangement being offered. And so all those structuring or deed contribution amounts, all that comes into the consideration of the administrator when they make that decision as to how to recommend. And so that sort of can often lead to a casting vote. And for those that are not aware of, to pass a resolution that contemplates a deed of company arrangement, you need to have 50% in value and 50% in number of votes of those attending, not in total creditors, just those attending. Yep. I've been in meetings where I've had 150 creditors and I've had 3 people turn up.
Yep.
And fundamentally, those 150 creditors have been locked into the deed as a result of the fact that they didn't show any interest in turning up. And so it's only those in attendance. And so that's where the casting vote can become quite risky for the administrator, I suppose. Did you have any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a very good point, Simon, and it is risky because it essentially involves the administrator going on a limb to a certain extent, because if you've got a split in that vote, because as you said, you rightly need it to pass in number and value, on a simple majority of 50% in terms of number and value. If you've got a split in that vote, so you've potentially got the number but you haven't got the value, or vice versa, you've got a situation where the administrator could exercise a casting vote to approve or disapprove the resolution. And that has been widely seen as a place of risk for the administrator to be, particularly if they're going on a limb, so to speak, and exercising that casting vote to approve a deed of company arrangement, particularly, as we've said, if it had a high degree of discrimination or differentiation, maybe is a better word, between creditor classes, and therefore opening themselves up to challenge later as to whether or not the casting vote should have been exercised, how it was exercised, and I think that does absolutely expose administrators to a high degree of risk for future litigation there.
Yeah. Okay, let's change directions a little bit. One of the, I suppose it's becoming more common. There's a couple of common things that we'll talk about, and I'll get to the creditors' trust structure in a second. But one of the other things that we're starting to see more commonly happen is actually this third party coming in and making the offer for the deed. So they're not actually the shareholders. Do you want to sort of run through the steps or the additional steps that need to happen after a deed of company arrangement has been voted in by creditors around the change of shareholding?
Yeah, there's as you're pointing to, Simon, there's the section 444GA in the Corps Act, which is essentially entitles the administrator to transfer shares if the administrator's either got the written consent of the owner of those shares, or alternatively leave of the court. And in essence, the court will grant leave if the transfer would not unfairly prejudice the interests of those creditors, which essentially means that if you can show that the equity has no value and there's no value in those shares, i.e. the value in the business breaks in the debt and therefore the shares are effectively worthless, what you can do if you can't get consent from the owner of those shares to transfer them, and that, let's think of a publicly listed company, for example, where you've got a huge disparate shareholding, you can through 444GA go and get leave of the court to transfer those shares, and that gives you a lot of flexibility in the ability to structure your deed of company arrangement. So you can almost effectively forcibly transfer those shares when faced with opposition from some of those shareholders, if you can satisfactorily show to the court that there is no value in those shares. And I guess that just really, as you can imagine, increases the flexibility and the options that are available to administrators and proponents in how they might structure their deeds and how they see the business looking on the other side for them.
Yeah, and look, there's an added cost. I mean, you've got an independent expert report, you've got legal and counsel involvement affidavits, you've got to send out notices to the shareholders so they get notified of the fact that this application is being heard in court.
Yep.
And so that is one of the things that the deed proponent needs to think about is what are the costs of actually achieving your goal of getting control of this company. There's the administrator's cost, the deed administrator's cost, and then the legal steps around that, whatever that may look like.
And that can be really expensive, like you're alluding to, Simon. I mean, I think of one example I did, which was actually a dual Australian-Singapore listed company where we did a 444GA application. So we had to firstly go and prove in the Australian courts that the shares had no value, get an independent expert report, also very costly. You have to give notice of that application to all of the shareholders. They then can come and be heard if they want. And invariably, you get a lot of people who don't understand that process, unhappy with, the fact their investment is now worth nothing, come along and object. And so that is a costly court process. We ended up succeeding in that regard, but then we had to go and, because it was dual listed, we had to go and get effectively a foreign recognition of that judgment in Singapore. Again, another court process, ultimately obtained it. But I think rightly, as you point out, it's a very costly exercise. It can be time consuming and there's a degree of risk if you don't manage to establish what you think you can establish, that there is no value in those shares. So they're all, it's things to think about in terms of how you structure your conditions precedent and the prospects of you actually being able to successfully complete and effectuate your DOCA.
We mentioned earlier about the process being reasonably quick. Often when we're talking about large companies, mining companies are a good example, the complexity is so great that the 20 to 25 business days doesn't practically work. Do you want to run through sort of what are the options available to the administrator when that situation arises?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Simon. That 20 business days or 25 over Christmas and Easter, it's deliberately been structured as being very short to try and get the process moving quickly. But as you're rightly pointing out, in larger, more complex administrations, it's almost inevitable that is not enough time for that independent administrator to properly conduct investigations and then go through an appropriate sale and recapitalisation process to sort of entertain DOCA proponents that might be out there. So I guess the two options you've really got is to apply to the court for an extension of what they call a convening period, the 20 to 25 business days. And yes, those applications are almost invariably granted by the courts where you can show that it's large, it's complicated, and you need more time. I guess your other alternative, which has sort of come out over and become more prevalent in recent years, is what they call a holding DOCA, which is, in essence, a deed of company arrangement which may have a limited, or I guess the High Court recently in Mighty River has said potentially even no return to creditors in that immediate time, but it allow there to be an extension of that period pursuant to which, in essence, and can provide further runway for that sale and recapitalisation process to be run by the administrator. So you've either got really two choices. One is going to the court, getting an extension, and two is going to the creditors and putting forward what they call a holding DOCA.
Yeah. Is there anything to elaborate on that holding DOCA? Because we are seeing that sort of, it's a bit of it comes in and out of favour. We saw a few of that happen during the GFC. We're now starting, and it often sometimes links with construction companies. They're the ones that I'm most aware of. But is there any, just talk me through the specifics of what a holding DOCA is.
Yeah, so in essence, you're deferring what might be true. The instances I've seen them used successfully, at least, has been that you're trying to give yourself an extended period pursuant to which the moratorium continues to apply, and you will not, and you, therefore to align, I guess, more consistently with what you think is as administrator, what you think is an appropriate period for a sale and recapitalisation for what is a complicated asset and business. Now, I think about the examples where I've been involved in one, which is again in a mining context, but it was really almost a mixture of a recapitalisation and a holding DOCA. There was a standstill with the key secured creditor. There was a small upfront injection of new capital by one of the cornerstone shareholders and a key trade creditor, being people who have key stakeholders in the company. And that new capital, whilst it was small, was split between, I guess, the claims of unsecured creditors, which gave them already a better return than they get in immediate winding up, but also just doing some refurbishment of the mining equipment and the processing plant, which allowed then processing of ore stockpiles, which were there to get started, and the company then could start, which was in care and maintenance at that point, so they could restart processing at least. The company could wash its face during a period, and then what they did effectively is they've got a moratorium for a more lengthy period while they try and reposition the company so that it can go through a new share issuance. Ultimately, this is a publicly listed company, which would allow, ultimately, if they can get that new share issuance away, to get that new share issuance money, give a further return to the unsecured creditors, and also potentially recommence open pit mining and underground mining. So back to your position about how they used and what do they do. So in that respect, that's not a pure holding DOCA, but it's a combination of the elements of utilising a part of a holding DOCA with other elements of giving them a small, giving creditors an immediate return with the prospect of getting more in the future. And then also potentially, if the capital raise can be gotten away, then ultimately the company coming out the other side and recapped. So they can be used in very flexible ways, in short.
Yeah, the theme I hear through your response there is it's about trying to increase the return to creditors, and that's why they need the longer period sometimes. But there's a commercial part too, which sort of, one of the things that a D proponent needs to think about is, yes, I'm going to have this bucket of money or whatever that is to pay to do a D contribution in the DOCA. Now I've got this business. I need working capital, and so one of the important things that D proponent needs to do is to make sure that, yes, I'm going to pay this money to get the company, but do I have enough money to get the business going or restart it again? There is an obligation around making sure the administrator doesn't put a company back, an insolvent company, back into the market, and there is an element of part of the process an administrator goes through to make his or her recommendation that the company needs to be profitable, and often what we will see is that there'll be an amount of money that gets paid in, usually from a third party source. But then the company may still actually be continuing to generate losses, and so there is a fear factor that. And there's been certainly, and it happens more probably in the SME space more than maybe in the larger ones, but that the company goes into a DOCA, it starts to trade again, and then within 12 months, 2 years, it's failed. And in fact, it's not just the SME. I mean, we could probably rattle off a number of retailers that have done it multiple times. So, is there any thoughts that you have around that? So, what are the obligations that we, as administrators and the D proponents, should think about when it comes to restarting the business?
Well, that's exactly right, Simon. You raise a really good point, which is that administrators do have that obligation to ensure that the company is coming out in a healthy state. That's, I guess, the whole purpose in compromise. Give it the powers that have been under the Act, being able to compromise those debts. But ultimately, it's also got to be able to result in something in a business that hopefully is successful and will come out the other side healthy. And with that in mind, there may be, I guess, like you're alluding to, commercial or other, I guess I'll call it market factors, which may make it difficult at one particular point in time to allow that to occur. But it may be that whether it's the market conditions or I guess other counterparty conditions, that in the not too distant future, the company could be in a much better position, in which case something like a holding DOCA, which allows some time and water to go under the bridge before you're looking to bring the company back into existence, where it may be in a more favourable conditions, you can utilise a holding DOCA. So the example I gave with that listed mining company, there it was to allow it essentially to bridge ourselves to a position so we could do a market recap through a further share issuance. But it might be a scenario where, more simplistically, there'd just be more favourable conditions in terms of how that business might operate, rather than a share issuance per se, which warrants a holding DOCA being imposed such that you can bridge yourself to that more favourable market conditions. And I guess so long as you're ultimately aiming for a scenario that results, as the administrator, in a better return to the creditors and a better prospect of the company continuing existence on the other side, then I think you can reconcile with those overriding duties, entering into a holding DOCA, for example.
I'll just one quick comment to make. At the end of the day, the D that's put up has to be approved by creditors. So creditors get the ultimate say as to whether they accept the deal or not. And I think that's important. We talk about this. People might be assuming that it just gets pushed through by the administrator, and no, it's got to be voted upon. But one thing that we did talk about was a creditors trust. So talk me through what that is and why that's becoming a bit more popular.
Yeah, creditors trusts are one of those kind of creative solutions that the insolvency practitioners have come up with to try and fix for a scenario that, if you think about a situation where you may have a company that has a lot of creditors, and there needs to be, even if the DOCA is approved and there's going to be a return to those creditors, there still needs to be an adjudication process by the administrator, who then will become the deed administrator, to allocate the fair share of the available fund to those creditors. So adjudicate the claims. Now that can be potentially it can be quite a lengthy and time-consuming process. Now, to avoid a company going into a deed of company arrangement and then remaining subject to deed of company arrangement for a lengthy period of time, the idea was created to allow the company to exit a deed of company arrangement in a more timely fashion by taking all of the creditors who have claims against that company, who have agreed in relation to the deed to compromise their claims at a certain level, can also agree as part of that structure that their claims will be moved across into a creditors trust, whereby they no longer have a claim against the company, but they have a claim against the trust fund, which is essentially still the same deed fund, but admittedly it's held almost invariably by the deed administrator who administers the deed, but then they also have a separate hat, but which is the creditors trustee, and they will administer that trust and the fund such that the creditors have transferred their claims across into a trust, no longer have a claim against the company, but have a claim against the trust fund, to have essentially the share of the DOCA fund or the proceeds that have been put there by the proponent that they had voted upon as part of the deed of company arrangement. And why is that useful? Because it really allows the company to be cleaned up quickly. That's the subject to the DOCA to come out of being subject to deed of company arrangement and then continue in its existence, which is one of the fundamental objects of Part 5.3a, in a much more timely and efficient manner, but still preserve and give those creditors the same entitlement they would have otherwise got under a normal DOCA.
Yeah, and look, it is a very public process, the voluntary administration deed of company arrangement period. You have to, on all your legal documents and all your correspondence, put the words administrator appointed or subject to a deed of company arrangement. And that in itself is a brand impacting event in the sense that, you'd be probably a little naive to think that the administration process doesn't have brand damage to a business. It does, right? But the sense of resolving the financial issues outweigh the brand damage that may result because of the appointment of the administrator. So that's where I see the creditors' trust being quite attractive, because it gets that business. And usually, if it's a new owner, they just want to be out there saying under new management, doing all the the usual corny advertising that you see with new business owners coming out, and instead of having to worry about the fact that it's in a deed of company arrangement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, we've got we're sort of getting to the end of the podcast, but there is so much in this process around the deed of company arrangement. Just one quick one I wanted you to touch on. People would have heard of the word scheme of arrangement. Tell me just briefly, we've got a couple of minutes, just, what's the difference between a deed of company arrangement and a scheme of arrangement?
Look, it's a great question, Simon. And I think there are some important key differences between a deed of company arrangement and a scheme, which mean that they'll both continue to be useful, I guess, structures going forward. Look, DOCAs, as we've sort of discussed today, essentially is a statutory process where the company itself enters into an arrangement enshrined by the statute where they will commit to doing a number of things, but principally the creditors have all agreed to compromise their claims against the company at a certain value, whatever that return will be. Now, schemes, they're actually they've come from a company's law in England a long time ago. There's actually a lot of history behind those, but they are much more, rather than I guess being a creditor-driven process where the creditors vote and at a meeting convened by the administrator, they're a much more court-driven process in the sense that you essentially have a process where you can have a scheme, which again can compromise. You can have both solvent and insolvent schemes. So schemes can actually, in many ways, are more flexible because they can do a lot more. They're not just an insolvency process like a deed of company arrangement. They are also can be a solvent process, and they're often used in an M&A context to allow companies to take over other companies. But what you can do through a scheme is, in effect, you can do what you can do through a DOCA, which is compromise creditors' claims. But you can do it. You could also compromise secure creditors' claims who are not bound by a deed of company arrangement unless they vote in favour. And the scheme itself, in an insolvency context, yes, it requires creditor approval, but you have to differentiate between relevant classes of creditors who have communities of interest, and then you need to go through a two-court hearing process. So what I would observe about it is that is a more greater compliance issues for schemes than DOCAs in terms of them being more lengthy. I think they'd probably be more expensive as well in terms of you've got to do, get certain ASIC's got to be notified. ASX, is, if it's a listed company, it's got to be notified. You've got to get independent expert reports as well in a scheme. Whereas DOCAs, no court hearings required for a DOCA unless, of course, you get challenged on the basis that your DOCA is unfairly prejudicial, but hopefully you never end up there. And so scheme processes, yes, very flexible, can operate in both solvent and insolvent contexts, but I think they are more costly, more time-consuming, whereas DOCAs can typically be implemented more quickly, more efficiently, and essentially a creditor-driven process only. Yeah.
That's great. Well, that brings us to the end of the episode. And Sam, that's been amazing. Just some of the insights into the deed of company arrangement. Thank you for coming on to The Cut. And for those that want to reach out to Sam, he works at King Wood Mallesons. It is a large law firm, and they do specialise in very complex transactions and have a lot of expertise across all areas of specialty, not just insolvency, but other areas as well. So thank you, Sam, and thank you, everyone. And we will see you in the next episode.
Thanks, Simon. Really appreciate having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Cathro and Partners, The Cut. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. For more insights, please visit our website, cathropartners.com.au, or find us on LinkedIn.